Wonderful. Well, my excitement over Alison's birthday, I forgot to actually say a couple of introductory words about our featured speaker, Kenton Clymer. He, of course, is currently a Wilson Center Fellow and a distinguished research professor of history at Northern Illinois University. His teaching and scholarship have focused, as you know, primarily on American relations with South and Southeast Asia. And here at the center, he's been working on a book on U.S.-Burma relations. Prior to moving to Northern Illinois University, he taught at the University of Texas at El Paso and at the University of Göttingen in Germany. He's held Fulbright teaching positions at Silliman University, Damagat, Philippines, at the University of Indonesia in Jakarta, and at Rangoon University in Beijing. He's the author of 6 books, 3 of which cover the history of American relations with Cambodia. In 2005, his 2-volume study of the relationship won the Robert H. Farrell Book Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in the History of American Foreign Relations, broadly defined, from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. An updated and abridged edition of the history, Troubled Relations, the United States and Cambodia, 1872 to 2006, was published in 2007. His other books include John Hay, The Gentleman as Diplomat, Protestant Missionaries in the Philippines, and The Quest for Freedom, the United States and the Independence of India, published in 1995. He holds a BA from Grinnell College and a master's and PhD from the University of Michigan. So with that, Kenton Clymer on U.S.-Burma relations. Okay.
Thanks, Christian. I want to thank the National History Center for including me in this series. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here as a part of that. I also want to thank Christian and Roger for co-chairing this series all the way through this year. And I thought this might be a good opportunity also to pay an intellectual debt to Roger Lewis. When his book, Imperialism at Bay, came out in 1987, I was just kind of blown away by it. And it was a great help to me in formulating my thinking as I wrote my own book about the United States and the independence of India back at that time. I think I met Roger about that time, too, in New Delhi once. But today I'm going to be talking about the United States, Burma, and the Cold War from about late 1940s until the mid-1960s. As the Cold War emerged after the Grand Alliance fell apart following World War II, the United States responded with its famous policy of containment, containing the Soviet Union and international communism. And by 1950, that policy had achieved near universal applicability. And in Southeast Asia, that meant that the United States had adopted a policy that it would try to prevent the fall of any of those countries in Southeast Asia to communism. The fear was that if any one country fell, then all of the other countries in the area would be endangered as well. So the domino theory was alive well before President Eisenhower articulated it in a news conference in April 1954. As Americans, we know pretty well how this played out in Indochina, because that came to overwhelm all of our thinking as we got involved in the war in Vietnam, and before that supporting the French, and then taking over from them basically and getting involved in Vietnam. It's much less understood, I think, that for over a decade, the United States viewed Burma as equally, or at least almost equally, important as Indochina in its efforts to stop communist expansion, or perceived communist expansion, into the region. Given the many internal problems that Burma faced when it did become independent at 4 in the morning on January 4th, 1948, the United States feared that it might be the first domino to fall. And to prevent this from happening, the touchstone of American policy toward Burma was to try to do everything it could to prevent that from happening. Given Burma's strongly nationalistic polity and its touchiness about outside interference in its affairs, the relationship, however, was a very delicate one. Now, many of the problems that Burma faced derived from its colonial past and from World War II, at least initially. Burma was, of course, a colony of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. It was, in fact, a colony of a colony in the sense that until 1935 it was governed as a part of the British government of India. And only in 1935 did it get its own independent administration. As for World War II, the war really had a devastating impact on Burma. As you know, the Japanese moved through Southeast Asia very quickly following World War II, and there were great fears that it would move into India and link up with the Germans moving the other way. In fact, they did not go beyond Burma, but they did come to Burma, and of course they occupied Burma and fought the British and the Allies in Burma. And it was a very devastating affair for the Burmese. Let me just quote something that William O. Douglas wrote, the Supreme Court Justice, when he visited Burma a few years after the war. He said, her cities were first bombed by the Japanese, then by the Allies. During the Japanese occupation, there was misery everywhere. Over 2 million acres of rice land went out of production because there was no export market for Burma's surplus. The Japanese killed and ate over 2 million water buffalo, the faithful work animal of the peasant. They required the exchange of all British currency for yen. When the British returned, they repudiated the yen. Thus, everyone, from the lowliest to the highest, ended up with no money. Burmese buildings stood gutted by fire, the docks and wharves were battered, the mines were flooded, transport was almost at an end. But the post-war devastation did not end nationalist demands for independence that had begun well before the war. And Aung San, the father of the current democratic leader Aung San Suu Kyi, was the most important of the nationalist leaders, and he became the de facto prime minister after the British had decided to grant independence. Now, the Americans had some reservations about Aung San. He had fought with the Japanese until late in the war, and then he switched sides to the British. His politics were suspiciously on the left, but in the end, the United States supported Burmese independence with Aung San as the leader, and the United States thought that this was probably the best way that stability could come to this fledgling country so that it would be able to resist communist penetration. Unfortunately, Aung San was assassinated in July 1947, 6 months before independence was to come, along with about half of his cabinet. And this was a great tragedy for Burma because Aung San was perhaps the only person in Burma who was capable of uniting the country, and in particular attracting to the central government the various ethnic minorities who were highly suspicious of a centralized Burmese government. With Aung San's assassination, another Burmese leader, U Nu, assumed the leadership and became Burma's first prime minister, and he remained prime minister for most of the first 14 years of Burma's independence. And as I alluded to briefly before, he comes to be prime minister at a difficult time because within 2 months of Burma achieving independence, there were 2 armed communist insurgencies against the government. And equally serious, there were ethnic minorities who were not on board with the government. And this map that I have up here shows the various ethnic groups in Burma. And the Burmans are the ones in kind of the central area there. The Burmans are the majority ethnic people. But as you can see, there's large numbers of other non-Burman peoples living in the country as well. And many of them wanted autonomy or independence from Burma. After failed negotiations, some of them rebelled as well, most notably the Karens. And so there were 2 communist rebellions and a number of ethnic rebellions going on as well. As U Nu wrote in his autobiography, the Burmese government had, quote, taken on the appearance of an old house with rotten supports. It was a very difficult time. Now, the issue of these ethnic minority peoples was a delicate one for the United States, because during World War II, many of them had fought valiantly for the Allies, while many Burmans had supported the Japanese. Also, a significant number of them were Christians, including many of the Karen leadership, those who wanted separatism in particular. Most of them had been converted by American Baptist missionaries who had been in Burma since 1813, even before the British. The Hill peoples were decidedly anti-communist and pro-Western, and the missionaries who lived there and other expatriates in Burma generally sympathized with them. So you have these ethnic minorities in rebellion, many of them presenting a kind of a sympathetic picture to Americans. But at the same time, and I should say also that in addition to this pull, if you will, for Americans to support them, at the same time, the United States thought U Nu was naive, impractical, ideologically too far to the left. Just 3 months after independence, the American ambassador wrote that U Nu's views bore, quote, a considerable resemblance to the Communist Party line. But despite all of these reservations, from the beginning, the United States determined that it was in its interest to support the new government. Despite U Nu's leftist views, despite doubts about his abilities, despite his quick recognition of the People's Republic of China, and his declared neutrality in the emerging Cold War, his government was at least fighting the domestic communists, and that was good from the American perspective. And so as long as he determined to fight the communists at home and to maintain his country's independence, he would have American support, and the ethnic minorities would not. Indeed, the ethnic minorities were seen as a hindrance because their resistance meant that the government could not marshal all of its resources, military resources and other resources, to fight the communists. They'd have to divert a lot of that to dealing with the ethnic minorities. Now, many of these issues, communism, the Cold War, Christianity, the relationship of the Hill peoples to the central government, came together in 1950 with the arrest and trial of the famous Burma surgeon, Gordon Seagrave. This was the first serious crisis in American-Burmese relations. Seagrave was an iconic Albert Schweitzer-like figure, and easily the best-known American in Burma from the 1930s until his death in 1965. He worked tirelessly, lived modestly, knew 3 Burmese languages, and ministered to the needs of thousands of Hill peoples. In 1961, the diplomat Chester Bowles referred to him as, quote, the best American overseas. Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite both produced television programs about him, and President John F. Kennedy officially commended him. He was born in Burma, in Rangoon, in 1897. He was a 4th-generation Baptist missionary. His great-grandfather had arrived in Burma. His great-grandfathers had arrived in Burma in 1835. He left Burma for his education, went to Denison University in Ohio, which was then a prolific producer of Baptist missionaries, and then went to Johns Hopkins Medical School, graduating in 1921, and returned to Burma in 1922 with his wife, Marion Morse, also from a missionary family. And together they took over a moribund Baptist hospital in the town of Nam Kam, which is right on almost on the border with China. It's right up there. They built up the hospital with their own hands, in part. They established a nurses' training school, and theirs was the best facility, the best medical facility in northern Burma. They had to leave in 1942 when the Japanese invaded. And during the war, Seagrave and a contingent of his nurses served as a medical team, first for the British and then for the American armies in that area. For his work, Seagrave was decorated by both. From the Americans, he received a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a Legion of Merit Award. Early in 1945, he moved back to Nam Kam, rebuilt the damaged hospital, and resumed his work. Though he then broke with the Baptists. As he later recalled, the mission thought I was directly on the road to hell, and I thought they were. He remained a staunch Christian, but he ran the hospital as a non-denominational, non-sectarian institution. He was adept at publicity, and he wrote a number of books which were widely circulated in the United States. The three most famous are Tales of a Wastebasket Surgeon, published in 1938 before the war. Wastebasket Surgeon because when he left Johns Hopkins, he gathered up a satchel full of broken and outdated and used medical devices and took them with him to Burma. His most famous book probably was Burma Surgeon, 1943, and then Burma Surgeon Returns in 1946, which described his activities during the war and his return to Nam Kam. But in August of 1950, the government of Burma arrested him and charged him with high treason for assisting the Karen rebels. Now, the context of the arrest related to the Karen rebel occupation of the hospital grounds on two occasions, in September 1949 and again the following December. The government charged that during these occupations, Seagrave had given aid and comfort to the rebel leader Na Seng. It is significant, though, that the government had long been suspicious of Seagrave, the arrest was not made until August 1950. And it took that long, I believe, because during the first half of that year, the first half of 1950, relations between the United States and Burma had been improving. With the so-called fall of China, the U.S. was eager to supply economic and even military assistance to Burma, which Burma wanted to combat the various insurgencies. And the Burmese understood Seagrave's iconic status in the United States and so was hesitant to arrest him. But with the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950, the growing cordiality between the United States and Burma cooled. Talks about economic and military assistance languished, and probably of equal importance, Chinese nationalist troops, the KMT, the Kuomintang troops, which had been driven out of China as Mao Zedong's forces advanced and had taken up residence in Burma, caused a lot of problems for Burma. And there were rumors that they had covert support from the United States. So I see Seagrave's arrest as being related to the deteriorating bilateral relationship between the United States and Burma. The Seagrave trial is very important in another sense as well. Though Seagrave was very popular in the United States, and while the American embassy did everything it could to assist him and make him comfortable and bring him things he wanted, and did all to see that he was treated fairly, his views about the UNU government, and particularly about the Hill tribes, differed from that of the United States government officially. The United States had decided to support UNU and support the government against the ethnic minority insurgencies. By contrast, Seagrave was unquestionably sympathetic to the Karens, no question about that, and to other minorities, and he had a very dim view of UNU and his government. In April 1949, for example, before his arrest, he had written in a private letter that UNU should resign and then, quote, the decent Burmese and the extremely decent minorities, end quote, could band together and, quote, beat the daylights out of the Burmese Communists. And I would suggest that because of these differences, the United States could not use Seagrave as easily in its Cold War Hearts and Minds campaign in the same way that it would later use less complex and less knowledgeable figures such as Dr. Tom Dooley in Vietnam and in Laos. In the end, let's see here. Here's a picture of Seagrave. He was a chain smoker, among other things. This is a picture of him after the first appeal. In the end, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. He then appealed. On the first appeal, the most important charge against him was dismissed. And finally, the Burmese Supreme Court, on the second appeal, acquitted him fully, though it admonished him and said he had brought a lot of this on himself because many of the things which he said and did could reasonably be understood to be pro-Karen. I thought it was actually a very fair admonition that they had given him. He returned to Nam Kam. He lived there until his death in 1965, never once returning to the United States. Another more important Cold War development in Burmese-American relations was the existence of these KMT forces in northern Burma, the Kuomintang forces, nationalist Chinese forces that I mentioned earlier. Here's a picture of them, some of them in 1953. The KMT presence complicated Burma's relations with the new People's Republic of China. Just to go back to the map here a minute, Burma shares a 1,000-mile border with China, and so it always thought that it was important to keep on, reasonably good terms with China. And so the presence of the Kuomintang forces in Burma threatened the good relationships that it wanted with China, because China, of course, didn't like these KMT forces being in Burma. And ultimately, this issue poisoned relations between the United States and Burma for years to come. Officially, the United States denied any connection with the KMT forces and wanted to see them removed. But despite its great leverage over the nationalist Chinese government in Taiwan, the United States seemed unable to force their withdrawal. And a major reason was that beginning in 1950, the CIA, with President Truman's approval, covertly supported them. So publicly, we don't support them. Covertly, we do. Just exactly when the CIA began to support the KMT troops is not entirely clear, at least to me. But once the Korean War broke out, and more particularly after China decided to enter the war in October 1950 and moved in, I think, with troops in November, then the United States systematized its support for the KMT forces in Burma. And the rationale was that the KMT forces in Burma would cause Beijing to divert its attention from Korea, kind of like a second front, I guess, opening in the south. Now, this action on the part of the United States was controversial within the government of the United States. It did not have universal support. Many in the State Department thought it was unwise, of no use at all, counterproductive, might encourage the Chinese to intervene. After all, this was an irritant which might cause them to come in, maybe take over Burma altogether, making Burma the first domino, if you will. The Americans, of course, because this was all covert, kept denying that there was any support for them, and David McKendry Key, our ambassador in Burma at the time this support began, actually resigned his post when he found out about it, because he refused any longer to lie to the Burmese government and say that there was no American connection. In fact, thereafter, all American ambassadors assigned to Burma objected strongly to this policy, which they viewed as misguided, often writing very strong, angry, sometimes, cables back to Washington, back to the State Department. As late as 1965, Ambassador Henry Byrode wrote to the State Department, quote, "Up to the present, at least, I have, unlike my predecessors, not had to make untrue statements on this subject, the KMT, and I plan to keep it that way." So it was an issue that troubled all American ambassadors assigned to Burma during this period. Now, those who objected to this were not, soft on communism, to say the least. They just thought that supporting the KMT forces was both immoral and foolhardy. On the immoral side, the KMT had no right to be in Burma without Burma's permission, they pointed out. And in too many cases, the KM troops behaved like marauders and occupiers, attacking villages, harassing the people, and so forth. On the foolhardy side, strategically, the relatively small number of KMT troops posed no threat to the new government in China, and indeed, whenever they did move into Yunnan, as they did sometimes at CIA behest, the results were usually disastrous, and they were beaten back into Burma. Furthermore, as the Burmese said, the existence of the KMT troops there provided a pretext for the People's Liberation Army, the PLA of China, to invade Burma and endanger the rest of Southeast Asia. So all in all, many in the State Department, the ambassadors and many in the State Department thought this was a foolish policy and that we ought to press very strongly to get Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan to withdraw these troops. Eventually, Burma took the issue to the United Nations, and at some point in 1953, the Americans decided to make a good faith effort to expel as many of the KMTs as they could. They put enormous pressure on Chiang Kai-shek, who ultimately appeared to agree, although he privately intended to make only a sham withdrawal. But then he changed his mind and did help arrange a meaningful withdrawal, so that in late 1953 and early 1954, about 7,000 KMT troops were withdrawn and repatriated to Taiwan. But that still left about an equal number of KMT troops still in Burma, and the Burmese were not terribly troubled about that. They felt they could handle them as long as they got no more supplies from Taiwan. So after this was settled, at least temporarily, U.S.-Burma relations gradually improved. And in 1957, for example, the American ambassador wrote that the relationship was, quote, as favorable at present as at any time since independence. The Burmese praised the United States for its opposition to the recent British, French, and Israeli attacks on the Suez Canal in Egypt. They also approved very strongly of the American condemnation of the Soviet invasion of Hungary. And they had just signed in 1957, after months of tortuous negotiations, an economic cooperation agreement whereby the United States provided some economic aid, and even talks for military assistance were advancing. The Americans very much wanted a military assistance agreement so that the United States would have some influence with the Burmese military, which they thought was very important. But in 1958, the next year, the political situation in Burma deteriorated. UNU's political party split, and the Prime Minister survived a no-confidence vote only by having support from another party called the National United Front, which the Americans said was under domination of communists. Despite UNU's fervent pleas that he was, in fact, personally anti-communist, the Americans suspected that even if he was, he had had to make concessions to the communists as a result of the political situation. And so the Americans were quite nervous now about UNU's administration now in 1958. Another person who was also quite suspicious of UNU's intentions was a Burmese general, Ne Win. Ne Win was Chief of Staff of the Army and Minister of Defense. On September 25th, 1958, he forced UNU to resign and made him temporarily turn control over to the military. It was, as our Ambassador Walter McConaughey, put it, a polite coup d'etat. The Americans were quite pleased. They thought that UNU was both inept and, of course, too beholden to the communist and communist sympathizers, And also there was talk at this time that China was making threatening noises and might even move to take over Burma. So generally speaking, the United States was happy with the coup. The Americans thought that Ne Win would bring more efficient, effective government to Burma, and indeed he did. He removed political influence in decision-making. He provided an efficient government, which in turn resulted in a more orderly and law-abiding society. Taxi drivers now found out that they actually had to have licenses. They had to have their car lights in working order. Smoking was banned in theaters. Women who worked for the government were ordered to use less makeup and dress more modestly. Broken sidewalks were repaired. Pariah dogs were removed. 50,000, according to one account, 10,000 by another, somewhere in between maybe, were killed with poisoned meat, although this supposedly did not dishonor Buddhist sensibilities because the dogs had the choice as to whether or not to eat the meat. The U.S. was, of course, even more interested in Ne Win's approach to communists. And some years earlier, Ne Win had indicated to the United States his interest in having Burma openly side with the Western powers. And he still was, by 1958, strongly anti-communist. Once in power, he withdrew generous terms that U Nu had issued for communist rebels to surrender and put down their arms. The famous CIA operative, Edward Lansdale, praised the military's operations in this period, particularly their civic action operations designed to win the hearts and minds of the people. And Ne Win made it clear to the Americans in Burma that he was very much against communist China, telling the American ambassador that, quote, the Chinese communists hated him and his government. There was, to be sure, something of an undercurrent of concern about Ne Win's rule, which was arbitrary after all. But the predominant feeling was that the reforms that he had initiated and the anti-communist postures that he had taken outweighed concern about democracy. And the State Department was prepared to testify before Congress that, quote, on balance, the military takeover was a good thing. So the Cold War clearly remains fundamental to American thinking in the late 1950s. Once Ne Win had taken over, the United States did what it could to encourage close relations between Ne Win and the United States. The United States accelerated the delivery of military supplies, and they entered into negotiations to help construct a new highway from Rangoon to Mandalay, and northward from there to Myitkyina. That would be a good part of the country. Rangoon down there, Mandalay in the middle, Myitkyina up there. So the highway was going to go all the way up there. And given that such a project would be very provocative to China, it was significant that Ne Win's government wanted the United States to help fund and build it. Ne Win himself told Ambassador McConnachie that he wanted to build the road, quote, as a warning and deterrent to communist China. McConnachie was about ready to go back to the United States for a visit at that point, and he very happily told Ne Win that he wanted to, while he was over there, buy him a book called What We Must Know About Communism by Harry and Bonaro Overstreet. And Ne Win said he would be happy to have such a copy. American officials in Burma thought that the United States should really strike while the iron was hot, so to speak, and fund some projects that the Burmese wanted, that Ne Win wanted. As one of them wrote, if we do not exploit the opportunity now available to us, we will have no one but ourselves to blame should the pendulum swing the other way. Or, and maybe more importantly, Admiral Harry Felt, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command at that time, wrote, it appears essential that the U.S. should take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to move in while the welcome mat is in evidence. We may never have another opportunity as favorable to the attainment of U.S. objectives in Burma as that which now presents itself. In sum, Ne Win was not only making Burma a more efficient place, orderly place, but he was also now a major figure in the American Cold War campaign. In 1960, Ne Win kept a promise that he had made to return the government to civilian rule. Although belatedly, he said he would stay in power for 6 months. He stayed in power for 18 months. But he did then return the country to civilian rule, had elections. UNU wins the elections overwhelmingly and is back in power. Ne Win was not very happy about this. He had hoped that someone else would win. And many predicted that military rule would be restored in the not-too-distant future, as in fact it was. The one issue that emerged during Ne Win's 18 months in power that could threaten the new relationship between the United States and Burma was this KMT issue again, the Kuomintang issue. For a few years after it had been settled in 1954, it had receded as an issue. But about the time Ne Win took control in 1958, support for the KMT increased from Taiwan. Taiwan began sending over more airplanes, dropping supplies and that kind of thing, bringing more soldiers in too. And as the months passed, the KMTs became more and more troublesome. And in October 1960, when UNU was back in power, Burma secretly invited the Chinese PLA to come into Burma and help drive them out. And as the troops advanced, evidence of American complicity with the KMTs emerged. An Australian diplomat reported that, quote, astonishing quantities of brand new, modern U.S. ammunition and equipment had been abandoned. And pictures of this equipment were published in the Burmese newspapers. The victorious troops were drinking liberated cans of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, among other things. And so there's a big protest outside the American embassy. Meanwhile, however, the combined Burmese PLA attack on the KMT forces was having its effect, and thousands of them were fleeing across the borders into Thailand and Laos. And now the U.S. insisted that Chiang Kai-shek organize an airlift to evacuate them to Taiwan. John F. Kennedy, the new president, was very angry at all of this. And sent a strongly worded message to Chiang Kai-shek. I haven't seen the message, and I think it's still classified, but Assistant Secretary of State J. Graham Parsons stated that he could, quote, not recall any language of comparable severity being used with President Chiang on any subject in recent years. So it must have been a very strong message to President Chiang Kai-shek. In contrast to 1953, an evacuation was arranged with lightning speed, and several thousand KMT troops were evacuated. But many of them remained in Thailand and Laos, and over the years, many of them would infiltrate back into northern Burma, and there are still KMT villages there to this day. And they became quite famous in the opium trade over the years. Well, when Ne Win came back to power in 1962, and when he came back, his attitude toward the United States was dramatically different. And why was that? Well, one issue was this KMT issue. He was convinced that the CIA was involved with the KMTs even in this later date. He also thought that the CIA was involved with some of the ethnic rebellions, the Shans and the Karens in particular. But I suspect that his anger over these issues was more a symptom than a cause. And more important in a personal sense to Ne Win was the inconsiderate and cavalier way in which he had been treated on a visit to the United States in June of 1960. Just 2 or 3 months after he was out of office, he was invited and came to the United States. And customs officials apparently mistreated him and his party. He didn't particularly want to have any official meetings set up, but some were set up, and then he went, and on at least the first 3 occasions, the officials weren't even there. They didn't show up. But I think what was probably the most serious lap occurred when he was hospitalized at Walter Reed Medical Center. He was something of a hypochondriac, and he was always getting examined in London and sometimes in the United States. And while he was hospitalized there, his wife Kitty and her friends were apparently racially insulted. By one account, when Kitty and her friends were walking up the hall near Ne Win's room waiting for the nurse to come, quote, this is a quote from a letter by an American diplomat, a piercing voice through the open doorway in one of the neighboring rooms screamed a racial insult at them, telling them to get out of there. And, quote, the voice allegedly belonged to Mamie Eisenhower. Now, this is quite touchy, of course. Now, I had my intern check, when I read that, I had my intern here check to see if Mamie Eisenhower was in Walter Reed. Amazing what he can do in the internet. In 2 minutes, he found out that she had been, in fact, in the hospital at that very time. So it is plausible that it happened. She was there being treated for bronchitis. And I've read two separate accounts of this, both involving Mamie Eisenhower. One by this diplomat who was reporting conversation with a British man whose wife was close to Kitty, and the other by a Burmese official with the IMF. So something happened there. Apparently, Ne Win was so angered by this that he immediately left Walter Reed, despite his physician's advice that that was a bad idea, and that he was going to have future trouble. And by at least one account, he did have to go back for emergency care later somewhere. So there's absolutely no question that his treatment in the United States at that time was a major factor in his strong anti-American turnabout. In June 1961, the Australian ambassador in Rangoon reported that the slights Ne Win had suffered during his visit to the United States had changed his mind about the United States. In 1962, a Burmese official confirmed this, telling the State Department officer that Ne Win had developed, quote, a genuine hatred for everything American. This feeling was so intense and unreasoning that Ne Win refuses even to eat American corn. He long remembered these insults. It keeps appearing in the diplomatic dispatches. In 1966, the American ambassador in Rangoon wrote to the Secretary of State that Ne Win's visit to Washington in 1960 was, quote, unbelievably badly mishandled. So, when Ne Win forcibly overthrew UNU on March 2nd, 1962, there was one fatality in this coup. His approach to the United States was dramatically different than it had been before. Shortly after taking power, he forced both the Asia Foundation and the Ford Foundation out of Burma. He suspended the Fulbright program, which caused considerable personal difficulty for those Americans who had made arrangements to come to Burma. He declined an invitation to visit the United States, indicating as his reasons the way he had been treated on his previous visit, also the critical response in the American press to his decisions to force the Asian Ford Foundations out and suspend the Fulbright program, and the generally bad state of U.S.-Burmese relations. He expressed no appreciation for the invitation, nor regret at not being able to come, nor did he suggest that a visit in the future might be arranged. In the next few years, he curtailed American public relations, publications, and programs. Foreign investment was discouraged as Burma embarked on Ne Win's infamous Burmese way to socialism. Tourism was discouraged. Finally, almost all missionaries and other foreigners were eventually forced out. To be sure, these latter initiatives did not apply just to Americans. They were part of Ne Win's larger effort to isolate Burma as much as possible from any foreign influence. But except for the Indians, who suffered the most because tens of thousands of them were forced to leave Burma, I think that these measures fell disproportionately on the Americans. In 1964, Ne Win canceled the Rangoon-Mandalay highway. There had been discussions going on since 1959 about that. Probably his reason was to reduce even further American influence in the country, although it must be said that the Americans were certainly not blameless in all of this because of the way they had changed things and had engaged in kind of dilatory tactics since 1960 or so. In 1964, Ambassador Byrode wrote that Ne Win was a, quote, a far different man than we estimated him to be in 1958, and again in 1960 when he voluntarily returned power to the central government. Still, in terms of fundamental foreign policy, the United States did not believe that Ne Win was about to sell out his country to China or to other communist powers, and therefore the United States was not fundamentally hostile to Burma under Ne Win. Under Kennedy and Johnson, as long as Burma resisted efforts to interfere with its independence, the United States could live with it, even though many Americans came to believe, and rightly so, that Ne Win was driving the country into the Dark Ages with his oppression and his misconceived domestic policies. As one official document put it, Burma under Ne Win is satisfactorily neutral, but dismayingly xenophobic and rigidly Marxist. The Americans would keep a very low profile while trying to exploit any openings to expand American influence and in subtle ways encourage, quote, Burma's natural propensities toward fear and suspicion of the Chinese, as Ambassador Byrode wrote in November 1965. So by this point, Burma is no longer very important to the United States in the Cold War context, except in the sense that as United States involvement in Vietnam deepened, it did not want to alienate an important country like Burma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenton, for this very comprehensive survey of the relationship. Let me start off perhaps the discussion by asking two questions. One is, could you just talk a little bit about the historiographical context? You're, assuming that you're not the first one to have worked on this, what are you, in what historiographical context are you writing? What are perhaps a couple of the major issues that historians are discussing? And then more specifically, I'm quite interested in what was the Chinese reaction to American policy vis-a-vis Burma during those years, given that we now have some greater access to Chinese perspectives and materials on these matters. So
I can deal with the first one more easily than the second one. As you know, as historians, the present has a lot of impact on the past. So ever since the war in Vietnam, there's been an enormous outpouring of scholarship, American scholarship, on Southeast Asia and on American relations with Southeast Asia. The preponderance of that, understandably, is Vietnam. There are literally thousands of books on Vietnam. But there are also now a number of very significant treatments of American relations with other countries in Southeast Asia. One of my favorite examples really is the Philippines. The United States, when it acquired the Philippines, fought a war for 3 years to subdue the Philippine resistance. It's called the Philippine-American War. It used to be called the Philippine Insurrection. As late as 1959, there was one semi-serious scholarly book on that. Now there are probably 20, and I think that's it's clear that as we focused attention again on Southeast Asia, we began to write about these areas. But Burma, there's almost nothing historically. There was a book by John Cady in 1976, I think it came out. John Cady was a practitioner. He had lived in Burma. He was, I think, our first Burma desk officer after World War II. And then he taught in American universities, I think mostly at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. And he wrote a book called The United States and Burma, but it published by Harvard University Press. But it's mostly about Burma. It's not so much about the relationship. So there just hasn't, and in any case, of course, that's now dated 1976, and most of the documentary evidence would not have been available at that point. So there really hasn't been much on the American-Burmese relationship in the broad sweep of things. In the case of China, the United States, of course, had no relationship with no diplomatic relationship with China at that time. The Chinese, but from what I know, which is not particularly deep, the Chinese were quite careful in their relationship with Burma in these years. They didn't want to appear threatening. They settled the border, the undemarcated border in a couple of areas during this period in 1960, in fact, settled on very generous terms, which bothered the United States. They were so generous. So the Burmese, they did not take the bait, so to speak. They did not intervene except when Burma asked them to in 1960. That's about the best I can do with that.
Could I ask also a question about context? You mentioned the CIA presence in Burma. Are we to be skeptical about this? Could you comment? Or how have you fared also with the problem of declassification of agency documents?
No, I don't think there's any need to be skeptical at all. I mean, there's no question that it occurred. It's even in the Foreign Relations of the United States series, there are clear indications that it yeah. Did you want to comment on it, Ross? No. Well, let me. No. There's. Yeah. Sorry. There's also that's one area in which there's actually a very good book that just came out in 2011 called "The Secret Army" by a former State Department official, Richard Gibson, working with the Chinese co-author, by the way, and he used Taiwanese sources, Chinese sources, interviewed people involved. So there's no question that occurred.
Well, I would, by the way, definitely encourage you to see if you can get further information out of the Chinese archives. And with Yafeng Xia here, we have one of the scholars who's done a lot of digging in these archives, and it's probably worth looking at that for an international history of the American engagement with Burma. Ross.
It's a question of how much is known, how much has been released about U.S. government decision making. In those first couple of years, you've said CIA. I assume, up to '53, this would have been the Office of Policy Coordination, Frank Wisner's OPC, which was really quite autonomous, except with budget from a lot of the CIA, but would have operated with policy direction. I mean, ultimately, of course, from the president, but from the Secretary of State and Defense. And I'm just wondering how much information do we have about that? You referred to sort of the outrage of successive American ambassadors, but the Secretary of State certainly knew what was going on. Do we have any evidence, that he was that Atchison or John Foster Dulles were arguing for a different policy? I just have no idea how much we know about the Asian side of this part of decision making.
Well, I wish I knew more about that myself. By one account, Atchison knew about it and supported it. But I don't know much more than that statement, I'm sorry, what was the second part? You said, you had a question at the end that I just missed.
I see at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, how much information? You're basically answering the question.
Yeah. Well,
how much? If we go back, which I haven't done, if we go back and look at Fruce, for example, how much do we have from the sort of the covert side of all this available?
Well, there are some CIA documents, but not operational documents, as far as I know. What you have, even in the Fruce documents, though, are clear indications of what was going on, without quite saying so. It's quite clear that something is going on, that the ambassadors know about it, and that kind of thing. Also, William Sebald, who was our ambassador from 1952, I believe he arrived in 1952. His diary is out at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, and his diary is filled with complaints about what's going on. One thing which one can say, you did mention Dulles, and Chiang Kai-shek may have felt that he was going to get a better deal with Dulles and the Republicans when they came in, but at least initially, and these are largely in the Fruce documents, the cables that are going out to Taiwan are very, very tough. By that point, I think there's been something that changed. Now, later on, they kind of soften again, but at least initially, they're very tough. But I don't have a way of getting quite at the at that level. I wish I did, you know, to know exactly what was being said at the very highest levels, and I just don't know for sure.
Okay. Sang Yuma. Center there.
Hi, I'm just a little bit curious about the role of the Ambassador Walter McConaughey in the political change in 1953 that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
The reasons that I'm curious about his role is because he actually moved to South Korea right after his tour mission in Burma. And back in, when he left Burma and moved to Korea, he also faced another political change in South Korea in 1960 when President Syngman Rhee had to step down. So I was and he obviously had a quite important role in the process of Syngman Rhee's fall. So I was wondering what kind of experience he had in Burma, and what kind of comparison can be drawn out from those experiences. Thank you.
Well, I don't know anything really about his time in Korea, so I can't comment too much on that. He was ambassador in Burma in the mid-50s, at a time when relationships were improving, until the coup, in 1958. And I can't, he reported what he saw, and he was critical of possible CIA involvement with the KMTs and that sort of thing. But I can't really say more than that. My impression during these years is that all of the ambassadors were pretty astute, in reporting on Burmese affairs. But I can't really comment more than that.
Charles?
I have one brief follow-up and then another question, but Mr. Johnson's question. It's quite possible the secretaries of state may have known what's going on, but the ambassadors could have been left out of the loop.
Well, they were.
That was one of the points I wanted to make, that they had no idea what was going on, that this was a rogue operation from the top with the CIA and people in Washington with the people on the ground.
But they found out about it. I mean,
they obviously they would, but and this went on elsewhere. Byro was ambassador in Egypt before he went off to Burma, and he found out that CIA was in Egypt, in Cairo, dealing with Nasser, when he didn't know that so-and-so was in Cairo talking to Nasser at all. So that this was quite common during that era. But my general question, who are these Burmese communists? Because you mentioned the communists on a number of occasions. And do they represent one group, or are they pretty much spread among the minorities as well as the main Burman population? Are they a real threat, or do they have some influence, for example? All these socialist tendencies, Marxist tendencies of various people who come into power. So are they a threat to government? Is this a matter of perception by American diplomats and the sources you read? Or do they really represent a major strand of Burmese society that anyone who came to power had to take account of?
I think they did. They were not without strength. First of all, there were two Burmese insurgencies, the White Flags and the Red Flags, one of which was more radical than the other. I think the Red Flags were the more radical group. But they did represent a significant insurgency for a decade or more. There were times when it was feared that they were going to take over some of the major cities. They kept cutting off the water supply. They would attack trains and that kind of thing. I don't know if they were ever on the verge of victory, but they certainly did represent a significant insurgency. It wasn't just a matter of perception. Yeah.
Hold on, I'll well, excuse me, I'm running the show here, so you'll please wait until I call on you. Yafeng Shah. Over there.
Thank you very much for excellent project and presentation, Kenton. I have two questions. First is, Ono was an intellectual, I guess, a civilian. How could he become the leader after the assassination of Aung San? I seem to remember Ono even was a playwright, right? he was a playwright.
He wrote plays. He was a devout Buddhist, preferred to take long excursions to Buddhist monasteries and take leaves of absence sometimes there. But he was one of the major independence leaders as well, going back to a group that was formed in 1935, the Takans. And he was, was very much there. He was obviously An Sang was the major leader, but after his death, he was a very popular leader, even if the Americans didn't think he was very efficient and effective.
Yeah, another question, just very quickly. If you look at the map, that Burma is sandwiched between two major powers, China and India. You know that in the 1950s, China was pursuing a more militant, confrontational foreign policy toward the United States, while India, during the Cold War, literally was charting also a third road, not siding with either of the two big powers. So what was the position of Ono in foreign policy, or his attitude toward the Cold War? Was he more sympathetic with the Chinese approach or to the Indian approach? Because I know that he was very close with the Chinese leaders, Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong in the 50s. Thank you.
Well, all of the Burmese leaders, including Anu, were strong nationalists and neutralists. I don't know of any of them that Sun Ne Win, early on had kind of secretly told the Americans that he would side with them, but they're certainly strong neutralists. They won't join SEATO. They didn't join the British group, Commonwealth. So Unu is very much of a neutralist. He likes Nehru. He talks to Nehru and works with him, but he also talks to Zhou Enlai, who regularly visits Rangoon. But all of the Burmese, regardless of their political affiliation, understand that Burma has a 1,000-mile border with China, and they have to have good relations with China. Privately, they all tell the Americans that they're anti-communist, and that they just have to maintain these good relations. It's kind of hard to know whether that's true entirely or whether or not they're just telling that to the Americans. But they certainly are neutral, and they're not going to be lured into alliances with anyone, and they certainly don't want to be under anyone's thumb, whether it's the United States or China or India.
Robert?
Thank you again for a very interesting talk. I'm interested in the pro-Japanese factions during the war and wonder whether they had any ties with Subra Chandra Bose, who was launching an invasion from Burmese territory into India, and also whether they maintained any ties with Japanese groups and whether the United States used those channels to maintain relationships with Burma during the more difficult periods.
What's the last part about the channel?
Whether the Burmese leaders maintained ties with Japanese groups that they'd express sympathy for, and whether the United States ever tried to use those Japanese contacts to develop a different channel of contacting the Burmese government.
I don't really know anything about the second part during the but when the Japanese came in Southeast Asia, in many areas they were initially welcomed as liberators, liberating them from the colonial power, and that seemed to have been particularly the case in Burma, because there was a Burma National Army which fought, on the side of the Japanese for most of the war. An Sang was certainly very much part of that, and then strategically he switched sides late in the war, when the Japanese, I guess, were probably going to lose. Do you know if there's connections with Bose? Do you know more about that, Roger?
I don't actually, but it's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Okay. The gentleman up front here, and I appreciate your waiting. You're right. You go ahead. Yep.
I just like to continue on that the communist question the gentleman brought up here, that other places they weren't so successful in containing the communist insurgency, especially having such a long border with China. I guess no support came into China for the communist insurgency in Burma. Or other countries, the communists were successful, but not in Burma. Could you expound a little bit more on that?
Well, the relationship between the Chinese government and the Burmese Communist Party is an interesting one, and I need to know more about that. The Americans were concerned that the Chinese were, in fact, supporting the Burmese Communist Party. In fact, sometimes it's a pretty strong allegation that they seem to know that. I don't know the degree of support which they had, but the Burmese military certainly was out fighting the Burmese Communists all during this period, and obviously the Chinese didn't interfere in that activity. So.
Yeah, Julia.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm trying to square Roger's initial question about how different Burma would have been had it stayed in the British Empire in 1948 with George Orwell's Burmese Days, which is a devastating portrait of colonialism, not just British, but particularly British colonialism, with this botched diplomatic visit, this diplomatic encounter, which wasn't supposed to be a diplomatic encounter in Washington. And I'm trying to make sense of it, because you're suggesting, Kenton, that this was a major turning point in U.S.-Burmese relations, the fact that this fellow was so poorly and shabbily treated in our nation's capital. And, of course, that then brings me back to Burmese Days. There must have been a raw nerve it must have touched not only an individual personal, but a collectively experienced raw nerve going back to the colonial period of racism, of inferior status. I'm just trying to dig out, or I'm really trying to disaggregate that incident to understand it, but look at it historically in terms of Burma's colonial past.
Well, there is all of that's true, and the Americans after World War II thought they had a somewhat better reputation with both the Indians and the Burmese, because they weren't British. I mean, they hadn't, they were more democratic, and they had not had this. They didn't like to think that they had a colonial past, and we had freed the Philippines and all of that. So the Americans do talk in those terms. The American diplomats talk in those terms, and there's no question too that Burma doesn't much like to maintain any connections with the British. After independence, they do have a British military mission there, but it doesn't get along well at all with the Burmese army or the government, and they're looking to the United States to be kind of a counter to the British. The Americans often push back because they say, the British are our allies around the world, and we're not going to do things that will inhibit that relationship. But there's great resentment against the British in Burma after the war, as far as I can tell.
Thank you. Yeah. When
it's Marvin.
Just, excuse me, minor factoid, at least I think is a factoid. Visited Burma in 1990, as I recall, Burmese military intelligence, a lot of conversations. The factoid is that and I didn't initiate this, but it was volunteered from the Burmese military crowd that was present at this, that the Chinese were supportive of the Burmese communist insurgency, and the Burmese military at that time, the officers remembered that as a personal experience that they'd been involved with fighting the communists, and the Chinese were behind the Burmese communists. I mean, so it was. It seemed to be a salient part of the kind of national memory, at least for the government, military folks at that time. The one minor thought. I'm just curious. Did you ever run into anything that suggested the importance of astrology as a influence on the thinking of Ne Win in particular, but the Burmese leadership more generally?
Well, I saw the movie where he was consulting with a, with an astrologer. The date, the time of independence, 4 a.m. in the morning on January 4th, was decided by Burmese astrologers as the most propitious time for independence to come. So I suspect it had some influence. I don't know that much about Burmese society to know for sure how important it is. On your factoid, I that reminds me that I interviewed the American chargé there in 2009, and he commented that some of the generals had Chinese shrapnel in their legs. And I think what he must have been referring to is exactly that, the fighting the communist insurgency earlier, which had resulted in assistance from the Chinese who provided the armaments and so forth. So probably there was assistance. I just don't know the level of it. Yeah.
Bob Hathaway?
Kenton, I have sometimes found it very useful, as I know you have too, to double-check the U.S. records by looking at what their British colleagues were saying.
Right.
And I know you've worked in the Public Record Office in the U.K. Burma was part of the U.S. anti-imperial, anti-British trope during the Second World War. By the 50s, the British and the Americans were at times uneasy collaborators in the war against the communist menace. Did your examination of the British records give you any particular insights into American actions, or did you find anything surprising in the British records which made you rethink what you'd seen on the American side?
It's always good to have records from outside observers, and I've used both the British and the Australian records. The Australians, they're in the neighborhood, so they keep close track of what's going on in Southeast Asia. Yes, they're very interesting. The British kept careful reports about the nature of American diplomats, often kind of looked down their noses at some of them as being, not very professional, this sort of thing. But another thing that was more substantive really had to do, to go back to this KMT issue and the CIA involvement in it. The British were very concerned about that. They were very upset about it. And they made representations to the State Department at very high levels to try to get that stopped. And so that was one thing that I learned from the British records that was particularly interesting.
Have one little question. I don't quite know much about the pariah dogs. Can you tell me more about that?
About
pariah dogs that were supposed to be poisoned. Okay, but that's a very small one. So my next one, does the CIA covered president have anything to do with the oil reserves there? As far as I know, Brits were really kind of into that part. And the last question, I briefly saw an article in a Chinese newspaper. It's a very recent one. And it says something like Burmese generals are tricking American and Chinese general in their new Cold War. Would you please give a comment? Doesn't have any historical background. It's a recent article.
I'm sorry, tell me again the
So
last
it's
point.
a quote. It's the title of the article, and the journalists, they're doing speculations, and they said that the Burmese generals are tricking or trying to take advantage, I don't know how to translate better, of American and Chinese general in their new Cold War. In a sense, new Chinese-American Cold War. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll try. I don't know much about the dogs other than what I said. That apparently there was a large number of dogs, kind of wild, feral dogs running around the town, and Ne Win decided he'd clean them up, and that's what happened. That's all I really know about that. I can't really, I don't know about the oil reserves. I just don't know whether that's a factor. The United States did have some oil interest there even back then, a small number, what's a Coney vacuum or whatever it was maybe in there with some oil. I'm not sure if the CIA had any, opinions about that or did anything about that. In terms of the current situation, that's an interesting observation. Actually, I think Burma is quite astute at getting advantages from one side or the other side. And my own sense of this, and don't claim to be an expert on current events in Burma, but my own sense of that is that they have been driven rather close to China, in part maybe because of the sanctions and others. They've become quite dependent on China, and they don't like it. They're too close to China, and that accounts in part, I suspect, for the current opening. I don't think that the Burmese are going to be close to anybody ultimately. If anybody thinks that the Burma is going to turn out like the United States, that won't happen, I don't think, even under Aung San Suu Kyi, because they're Burmese. They're not Americans, and they're going to keep at arm's length, I suspect, all countries.
Thank you. Yep.
I was very struck by your saying that the Chinese resolved the border dispute so generously, and that the U.S. was upset by that. Considering that there's still undemarcated border between Burma and Thailand and India and China's dispute, I mean, that's quite a statement. Why were the Chinese generous, and Why was the U.S. upset by it?
Well, one rationale is that, well, a couple of things. One is that they wanted to demonstrate that they were good neighbors, so that the Burmese would, be closer to them. Another thing which came up in the things I was reading was that they did want to deal with this dispute with India. And now that didn't work out so well. They ended up in a war with India, right, for a while. But the idea was to show to the Indians that they could settle these things amicably, and hopefully that would work out with India. But it didn't. I'm sorry, was there another part to the?
Well, why was the U.S. upset?
Well, the U.S. was. When the border negotiations started in 1956, they started in 1956, and they didn't get concluded until 1960. The initial offer was a fairly generous offer in 1956, but it didn't get concluded for various reasons, probably on both sides. And the Americans took the position that this demonstrated that China really didn't want to settle that issue. This was just their way of gaining control kind of over the Burmese by having this hanging over their heads. But the Americans were kind of pleased that it wasn't settled because that demonstrated Chinese perfidy. They wouldn't settle, Then when they do settle, this just seems to kind of undercut that argument. And so there's a certain... They don't want to show good grace in a sense, but they can't quite come out and say, isn't it wonderful that you finally settled this difficult border issue.
You might, by the way, be interested in there's a major new project on China's borders being set up by Chen Shua, our partner at East China Normal University. So I don't know if they've got anybody working on China-Burma border, but I think that would be a project would be of interest. Yafang, do you have anything to add to that? Hold on.
Very quickly to explain why China was very generous to Burma and not to India. That from 1956, the PRC actually made concessions to many smaller Chinese neighbor countries like Burma and later on to North Korea. And if I remember clearly, there are also Pakistan but not to India, not to India, and not to Soviet Union later on, because the Chinese want to be tough on big power, but generous to smaller nations. So the communist China made huge concessions on border issue with weaker and smaller nations. That's its stated policy. Yeah.
Thank you. Anita, hold on, microphone.
You spent a fair amount of time at the beginning of your presentation talking about the missionary presence in Burma, and I was struck by how far back it goes, though I guess that wasn't unusual, or was it? I mean, you might comment on that, but how does Christianity play out after the war? You didn't really talk about
after World War II.
After World War II, during the Cold War, during the period you're talking about.
Yeah, the first missionary to arrive there, Baptist missionary, was in 1813, and he and his family got there kind of by chance. They went to Calcutta in 1812, and they weren't welcome, so they got on the first boat, and it was going to Rangoon. So that's where they ended up. But it is kind of interesting. They were there, before the British were, and they had a fairly significant influence. And I think it works out after World War II in the sense that they had significant influence among the Karens and among the other hill peoples, the Kachins and others, that was a complication in the Cold War because it would be nice to go into this culturally, which I didn't and I haven't really attempted to do yet, but the fact that they were Christians gave them a lot of cachet in the United States at that time, I would say. Given the Cold War perspectives, the atheistic communists versus the Christian, the good Christian minorities, and here the Burmans are mostly Buddhists, although there was also a Christian minority among them. So I think that would be a very interesting thing to explore in more depth. The Baptists weren't the only ones there. There were a number of others, but the Baptists had the predominant influence.
Thank you. You were recently in Burma. You visited the country. I was wondering, first of all, can you tell us anything about the Burmese Archives? Are they open? It's sort of a professional handicap that I have to ask that question. But secondly, I wonder what role does this history, this U.S. Burmese history, play? Does it play any role at all in the collective memory today as the United States seeks a new relationship with the country?
The first question about the archives does bring up a story. I went there in December 2009, partly to see if I could use the archives over there. And I didn't know exactly where they were, so I went into the concierge at the Strand Hotel, which is the big 5-star hotel, very nice hotel, and I asked her if she could tell me where the archives were. And she didn't know, but she looked it up in the phone book. And, you know, here it was, here's some phone numbers and so forth. But she said, you know, they don't let foreigners in there. So I went, and I got in, and it happens that the vice chair of the Myanmar Historical Commission actually was a graduate of our university, had a PhD from NIU, and that perhaps helped, and his daughter worked in the archives. But I was frankly very surprised. You know, first of all, it was functioning. I got there at 10 o'clock when it opened, and people were streaming into work. And I was brought in, and I paid my $30, which is for what you pay for an annual pass. And I went into the room, and there's a bank of computers. You know, I was just kind of blown away. I've been in the Cambodian archives that I was in once, you know, had nothing like this. They had a bank of computers there, and you just plug in what you want in terms of a topic and see what comes up. And you don't get the documents, but they tell you what files they have that are related to that topic. So I plugged in United States, and 150 hits came up, half of which were United Kingdom because they couldn't distinguish between, or at least I didn't do it well probably, between United States and United Kingdom, but still a large number of files relating to the United States. So I spent a few days there going through what I had, and they're actually there, and there are files, and they bring them out to you, and you can take notes, and they will make copies for you. When I was there first time, they would only make copies and put them on a CD, but this last time I was there, just in February, in February, they actually are making photocopies now for you. So it's a functioning archives. I plugged in KMT, incidentally, this last time, the Kuomintang forces, and 10 files came up, and I only had time to look at 3. But I copied 100 pages or so. I should go back and look at the other 7. So there's a functioning archives there. There were people there. I wasn't the only one. You can use them.
Great. The history piece.
Remind me, would you go say that again then?
Just since you were there, and I assume just breathing the air there in Rangoon and talking to folks, the history, the relationship would come up. Does it play any role in the current reopening of the relationship?
Well, I did interview 4 Burmese people there when I was there. 3 had connections with the government. 1 was still in the foreign ministry. And I also interviewed U Tin Oo, who is Aung San Suu Kyi's chief of staff, so to speak. And they all, not all, there was a lot of talk about kind of American cultural influence over time in Burma, including some references to the missionaries, as I recall. So I think there is some resonance there. I haven't really tried yet to kind of analyze that in the more recent period. One thing, when I was there the first time in the archives, they kind of wanted me to see a file on the Rangoon Mandalay highway, and I think, and again I'm not up to snuff on this entirely, but I believe although Ne Win canceled the American involvement in that highway, that the highway was built eventually. Fairly recently, I think, using the American plans. The Americans had come up with 3 possible routes, you know, different costs, and you do it this way, you do it that way. And I believe those plans were ultimately used by the Burmese. So,
thank you. We're out of time, but let me just, that's the final question then, yeah?
The 2-finger on the business of history and sort of current influence. Carl Jackson, who runs the Southeast Asia program at SAIS, visited Burma. He's been there several times now recently, but visited, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago or so. Showed up, first meeting with Burmese officials, question from the Burmese side, when is Johns Hopkins going to reestablish its campus in Yangon? Well, there isn't one person out of 1,000 at Hopkins that knows that there ever was a campus. But the Burmese remember it, and they brought it up right off the bat. And it's now become an active part of the conversation between Hopkins and the Burmese government.
All right, I think that's a good note to end on. Let me thank Kenton for the stimulating presentation. Let me also use this moment for an opportunity to thank Roger Lewis, my co-chair here, for the partnership in yet another semester of wonderful series of events. While I do some of the more of the talking here at the end of the table, Roger's really does the heavy lifting and is the spiritus rector of this Washington History Seminar behind the scenes. So my thanks to Roger and Marion and the National History Center for this really wonderful partnership. Let me remind all of you to go back home, mark your calendars, Monday after Labor Day, 4 p.m. It's the next Washington History Seminar until we go through early December, and we have really a great program lined up already. And I think I also speak on behalf of Roger in encouraging you, if you enjoyed the series, if you'd like to generally be supportive, the National History Center and the Wilson Center, there's a little bit of resources that go into organizing this. We're certainly always open and welcome support of any sort for this seminar. Thank you all for joining us this time, and many of you for a good part of the semester. It's been just a great, great series. But let's give a round of applause to Kenton for a great talk.